Hello, Shift Book Clubbers. We're trying something new here tonight, discussing Vivian Gornick's classic memoir, The Odd Woman in the City. Yeah, look at the beautiful, beautiful new edition from Dawn Books. And we're with the memoirist Amy Key, who wrote the foreword of this brand new edition. Before we talk about Vivian, a little bit about Amy. Amy is a London-based poet and writer whose memoir, which I also have here, Arrangements in Blue, was published in 2023 to critical acclaim, described as a cathartic meditation on singledom by The Guardian. Amy uses Joni Mitchell's seminal album Blue to honor a life lived by oneself. That's like, I feel a bit uncomfortable saying by oneself, but I think that's what the review said. So I'm going to stick with that. It's an essential read about building and living a life on your own terms, which makes her the perfect person to introduce Vivian Gornick's classic about friendship and aging, love and sex, loneliness and aloneness through the lens of New York City. It was first published in the States in 2015 when Vivian was 79. She's now 89. She's a journalist, critic, essayist, memoirist who has written numerous books, including the fantastic Fierce Attachments about her relationship with her mother, which, if you haven't read it, I really, really, really recommend. Completely love it. It was named the best memoir of the past 50 years by the New York Times Book Review. Vivian's been nominated for the National Book Critics Circle Award 3 times and shortlisted once. I think for Fierce Attachments, is that right, Amy? I don't know. Do you know?
I don't know.
Sorry, I've
To be honest.
immediately done that. I'm sorry. Vivian began her career at the Village Voice in 1969. And throughout her career, wrote for the New York Times, The Atlantic, Nation, New York Book Review, blah, 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 blah. Um, and I've done all the admin already, so we'll just get straight into it. Amy, for anybody who hasn't done as much homework as you, oh, Nicola says, Amy, she came to your event at Cheltenham in 2023 and you were
Oh,
fabulous.
that's lovely. Yeah. Oh,
Nicola's a bit
thank
of
you.
a Cheltenham hardcore, aren't you? She's like, I think
It was a
we
lot of
met
fun,
up
that
there.
event.
Who were you with?
I was with Olivia Petter and Emma Forrest.
Oh,
Yeah.
brilliant. That
Yeah, it
must have
was
been
really
lovely.
great. It was really great.
Really good. So, for anybody who doesn't know a lot about Vivian, would you mind telling us a little bit about her background?
Yeah, sure. So, Vivian Gornick was uh, brought up in the Bronx, in New York, and she was the daughter of working class immigrant parents. Um, she, I think from like quite a young age, dreamt of herself as being like a leader, a revolutionary, I guess. Like her beloved icon Emma Goldman. And she was incredibly smart, and became an academic and a critic. She wrote for the Village Voice, among other places, and she really found herself as a writer on what she calls the barricades of radical feminism. That was the kind of place which she said gave her her point of view, like the place from which she writes across all of her memoir, but also her critical essays too.
Then this wasn't where I was planning to go in, but since you've just said that, one of the
Mm.
things that really interested me is how she has got a new, younger following, probably as a result of, well, and this came out, Odd Woman in the City came out in the States in around about the same time as Fierce Attachments was first published in the UK.
Mm.
And given that she's part of that real like second wave radical feminist culture,
Yeah.
I was quite surprised that the kind of new wave of feminists, the more millennial feminists,
Yeah.
embraced her because she's kind of like pre-intersectional,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
if you
I
like.
know what you mean. I know what you mean. I was trying to think about this earlier because, interestingly, I didn't read Vivian Gornick until possibly just before the pandemic. So I read Fierce Attachments and The Odd Woman in the City a few years after they were published, and I was reading them in the context of reading Elena Ferrante, and there was something for me about how Ferrante um, describes the interior life of women, particularly working class women, the relationships between men and women, and women and class. I found it really kind of aligned well to Gornick, and I almost like was seeing the writing as part of the same universe where these kind of very brutal emotional truths are delivered to you, in Ferrante through her fiction, but for Gornick through her nonfiction and memoir. Um, yeah, there was just something that was so searing about the the kind of emotional truth of the writing, which is the thing that spoke to me. And I'm not a millennial, like I'm 46, so I think I get like chopped off from even being a geriatric millennial. But
Oh, are you not even a Xennial?
is that is that what
Yeah.
is that what it is that what
Is
it is?
Are you like Gen X
Oh,
millennial cusp? I don't
I
know. I don't
must
quite know
be,
how it
yeah.
works.
Yeah, Gen Alpha Rising or something. But so yeah, there was just something there was something really exciting for me in that writing, which yeah, it made it feel as though it had been written 40 years ago, but also it could have happened yesterday. So it had this sort of timeless quality for me.
It's so interesting because I would never have put those two together.
Mm.
But now you say it, it just, it kind of just like, yeah, obviously. But no, I think, you know what? And I've read so much today trying to like pretend to be an expert in Vivian Gornick. Like Mel said, it's the timelessness of the writing that's historic and
Yeah,
contemporary.
yeah,
And like,
absolutely.
and in fact, the way it's written is like you don't really, it's not, if I say you don't really know where you are, that's not what I mean. I mean, it's so fluid that she could be talking about yesterday or she could be talking about when she was 60 and you doesn't, she just takes you with you wherever she is.
And I think there's something for me. She's expressing stuff in this way that feels so intimate and candid because it has an edge to it. Like sometimes the writing has this sort of tetchy quality to it, or she's really engaging with her shame or embarrassment or irritation with an issue, and that yeah, not to keep going on about Ferrante, but that's what really excited me about Ferrante's work too. It was just like very kind of raw, but so controlled because the prose is so good. The quality of the writing is so good. The expression is so clear. Um, yeah, so I kind of see them as, I don't know, yeah, paired in some way.
So when you first, was that what made you pick The Odd Woman and the City up?
I read The Odd Woman in the City because I read her book, The Situation and the Story, because I was becoming interested in writing prose. I'd previously published two books of poetry. Um, Her book, The Situation and the Story, is about the art of personal narrative. And I was so impressed with the book. I was like, why aren't I reading her memoir? So I went to Fierce Attachments first, and then The Odd Woman in the City a bit later because I was quite scared about reading The Odd Woman in the City because I felt like it would align too closely to all the things that were tearing me up emotionally. And you know how sometimes like it's not the right time for you to read a book, like you
Mm.
feel too vulnerable or tender, and you put it off. But actually, what do I want to say? I it kind of it wouldn't have mattered at what point or how like healed I was in terms of how I felt about the concerns, that I feel aligned to Vivian Gornick in this idea of the loss of romantic love in life and how that might how the absence of it might kind of tear at you and me. Um, I feel like I could be in any emotional state and I would have found the writing as affecting as I would at my most vulnerable, if that makes sense. And I think that's just because of like the power of the writing.
Yeah, because I had wondered whether, because very often when I speak to women for the shift,
Mm.
older women who are either divorced or single or just, for whatever reason, choice, bereavement, whatever, they very often say that they don't see their experience of
Mm.
life reflected back at them, whether it's on in me, TV, media, film, and in books, and that really is. I mean, it feels as a non. Maybe this I'm making this up, but as a non-mother, it feels to me like there is like an avalanche of books about motherhood,
Yeah.
and there are. I mean, I probably could. In fact, if you asked me to name them, I couldn't. I can't think of very many books about living a single life, whether it's through choice or circumstance.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt like, and I kind of write about this in my introduction, where was the literature for me? Somebody who doesn't have kids, doesn't have a partner, hasn't kind of gone through any of those sort of mainstream thresholds of particularly heteronormative life. Um, but it is all there, and Gornick's book is like one of the best that I've encountered, but she cites all of these different books within the Odd Woman in the City that have that she has been able to connect to her experience as being, as she describes herself, an odd woman. The title of this book comes from a book by the writer George Gissing, sorry, not Giddings, George Gissing. Um, and he wrote a book called The Odd Women. I think it's a he. If I've got that wrong, going to be very embarrassing for me, but
No,
unfortunately,
I kind of
um,
assumed it was a he as well.
yeah. So this is about like British feminists in the 1890s. And what really inspired Vivian Gornick is this idea that is represented in that book of women who just can't make peace with their place in the world. And that is going to feel as real to us in 2025 as it did to women in 1890. The terms of the deal are different, and the way that in which we can engage with the world is very different. But I think that idea of if you were to go back, if you were to look at literature trying to spot women who are not feeling at peace with themselves, you'd soon have a really big list,
Mm.
and you'd find this like richness of literature. Um, I say that, but when I was talking to a friend once about I had to compile a list of books where women live alone, and I was like asking friends if they could recommend one, and all we could come up with were books where the woman living alone like just went mad and was deranged or like did deranged things.
Yeah, or had fled some horrific.
Fled like a
Yeah.
horrific situation, or like her aloneness was kind of she was rescued from her aloneness by the promise of romance, but and one of them suggested Bear by is it Marian Engels? It's another book published by Dawn. But in this book, the woman has sex with the bear, and then we had to like agree that actually that was deranged and maybe mad. So we had to take that out of out of the list.
My God. And now I've just been sitting here. If anybody can think of anything, can you put it in the chat? Because I've been sitting here thinking, so I kind of thought, oh, Tenant of Wildfire Hall. And I thought, no, because
No.
she fled an alcoholic and he'd burnt all her. And then I just ran out of steam.
But it is interesting because I do think that people are now writing into a space of wanting to represent a life lived solo or like outside of heteronormative norms as aspirational, taking yourself out for dinner, this whole like TikTok trend about romanticizing your life. Um, I'm not against any of that, and I love to take myself out for a fancy dinner or like buy myself flowers or do all manner of things which are kind of saying my life can still have like this romantic quality even if there isn't a romantic partner in it. But what I most admire is somebody like Gornick who shows me like all of the texture of that life when it's bad and she feels wretched and when it's glorious and she feels free and alive. um
Yeah, there's no hashtag going on.
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it kind of struck me the way it's compiled, because it's not a narrative. It's not even really essays. If anything, it's kind of vignettes. And I
Mm.
think she described it as a collage.
Yes,
She,
yeah.
um, and it does feel to me like, and do anybody feel free to tell me I'm wrong, but Flying
Flying
Solo by
solo.
Linda Holmes. I've never heard of that or her.
No,
Interesting.
like Google that after.
Tanya says Joan Anderson tried In a Year by the Sea, but her separated hubby changed his mind and went after her. Yeah, great. It's quite interesting. It's interesting. Olive Emma Gannon, yeah. That's kind of the whole point of that book, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's like it made me, I think the construction of
Mm,
Old Woman in the City feels like the kind of writing that Americans are allowed to do more than Brits. It kind of
interesting.
slightly feels like all those writers who I'm going to sound a bit chippy now. Maybe I am a bit chippy. All those writers who go to those, American writing
Or
retreat things.
MFAs.
Yeah, and then they all blurb each other's books. So I'm going to regret saying that when it's gone up on YouTube. But it kind of feels like that kind of writing that those sorts of writers are allowed to do. Can you
Yeah.
think of any British writers who kind of have written in that vein? I was wondering about Deborah Levy.
Yeah, so I don't imagine that Deborah Levy's living memoir, the like the ch living
Yeah.
autobiography, like the trilogy. I would guess that they were assembled from many different sources in the same way. So like Gornick, I think um took over 30 years worth of diaries and notes to kind of compose this book, where you're never quite sure where you are in time in it, but it kind of has this flow to it. And I think British writers that do it, yeah, so I reckon Deborah Levy for sure. I'm thinking about, say, Lauren Elkin, probably would be another example of somebody who writes in that way, this kind of assemblage of fragments. And I like it in a way because it reminds me of poetry, the kind of placing of particular stories and narratives and strands of thought alongside each other, and the interruptions. And I think for the Odd Woman in the City, it's an interesting form because she is trying to write a book that almost replicates the movement of a city. So having like long strolls where you're engaged in a narrative and then you're suddenly interrupted with like a very short um outburst, if you like,
Mm.
feels like what it's like to walk in a city where you might, today I was crossing the road and I was looking at my phone, which I shouldn't have been doing, and a cyclist
Shame on you.
came like bounding towards me just as I decided that I was going to have to go back and to a different bit of the street. And I was like, sorry, sorry, sorry. And I thought I'd probably ruined that guy's day because I was just daydreaming and being an idiot. But there were all of these kind of I've used the word irritation too many times, but these little annoyances, these little rubs that you have when you're walking about a city, and I feel like it's replicated in the text in some way for me.
Yeah, a couple of people are saying that they struggled a little bit. They loved her writing,
Mm.
but they struggled a little bit with that structure because you kind of couldn't get absorbed in it.
Yeah,
You kind
yeah,
of, she didn't, take you on. She didn't make, and kind of conversely, good for her. She didn't make any attempt to take you on. I hate the word journey, but even a literal journey
mm.
with her. She just, like you say, dropped in and out and Frey using the Leonard friendship, whom I absolutely love, grumpy Leonard, and in
Yeah,
fact grumpy Vivian.
yeah. She's so
Using that.
grumpy.
I love that. I love their grumpiness. Everybody needs a friend who, one of those friends who's like, if you've got nothing nice to say, come and say it to me because
Yeah,
because
and
when if sorry, I was just gonna say if you're a glass half empty person,
mm.
speaking for a friend, um, it can be quite oppressive, all these cheerful people. They're nice, but only to a point. Sometimes you just want to have a really good moan without feeling judged.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because the Vivian character and the Leonard character sometimes allow themselves to do it, and other times they really go for each other for being negative. Like there's a scene, I think, where Vivian talks about going away with her niece and says, it's quite hard being with somebody 24/7 for 8 days, but we had a nice time. And he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry you found your niece so irritating."
Yeah, it's
He
like
couldn't let it go. He couldn't let it go.
yeah, it's like that. Yeah, it's that balance between the person who takes the negativity and runs with it,
Yeah.
but just doesn't. Yeah, I mean, I think I just found a note that I made actually, which kind of refers back to what we were talking about earlier about the kind of maybe glancing relationships that you might have
Mm.
in cities, which kind of goes back to the structure thing that we were talking about, that kind of because one of the things I really loved was those little encounters. Like my absolutely favorite thing in the whole book is
Yeah.
who's Vera, who is 90 and talks about her sex life in the pharmacy queue.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think also she's so New York that you just kind of don't get. I mean, maybe you do get those people in London, but outside of great big metropolises, those people are like people move away from them in the queue, whereas the
And
city
is that
can get
where
very
the
scared.
guy that she's sitting next to waiting, they burst out laughing about it. I know the scene that you mean. I'm trying to remember. I feel like she turns to a guy that's like next to her, and they both like share this moment about Vera.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Um,
Vera's the one about yeah, she's talking about when she says about her husband, how's he taking the stairs? And she's like, oh, him, he died. It wasn't a good marriage. Three people on the line turn around. But it doesn't really matter. He was a no good husband, but he was a great lover. And it's just like that
it's
kind
such
of
a good
weird
line.
urbanness, you know.
And I really love actually how she ends the book is she's sat at her dining table, her kitchen table, dining table, and she says something like she recalls all of the encounters she's had that day, those sorts of little interactions, and she says like, and in time they become good company, and in fact they become like the best company that I could wish for. And I really admire the way that she can get so much richness out of those really inconsequential interactions with people who will likely remain strangers, and kind of imbue them with significance and tenderness curiosity, because it made me think about like how I interact with strangers in the city, and like maybe I'm not very friendly, or like maybe I'm a bit dismissive, or I don't know, but she's paying attention to all of that, and she's kind of marveling at like the human experience in all of that. Um, and I feel like I could definitely learn something from that way of living.
It's like that lovely scene, I think it's quite early on, and it's like where she's going to bed and she turns the lights off and looks out of the window. And, you can see all the other people living their lives in the,
Mm. And she
let's
feels
say,
like
the
this companion,
suburbs.
she feels kept
Yeah,
company.
that kind of, I think that kind of cityness. I mean, one of the things that I mean, obviously the city is, without the city, even though it's not really a book about the city, without the city, there wouldn't be a book.
Mm.
And the way that, cities shift and change and how we map our lives on them. Like I've just finished reading Emma McBride's The City Changes Its Face, which is a kind of a follow-up to the Lesser Bohemians.
Mm.
And one of the kind of pivotal things about that is there's only a 2-year gap between the two books, and it's set in London in the 90s. But it's about the way we map our lives onto cities,
Mm.
and the city literally does change its face. So the way that I maybe walked around London, I can walk around London now and go, oh, that used to be there, and that didn't used to be a Starbucks, that used to be an X, and oh, it used to be better. And when I was in my 20s, that was such an old person thing to do. But you live alongside the city, and it
Yeah.
kind of comes to define you in a way. I don't know what I'm saying, really. I'm just saying it because I think it's
No,
interesting.
no, I know exactly what you mean. I feel I spent like I've lived in London since 2001, and I kind of have moved in every different corner, but I've been in Southeast London now for uh over 10 years, maybe 15 years or so. And I every now and then I realize how kind of villagey I've got, like I don't experience London in the same way that I used to. And I sometimes go into the center of London and feel like a tourist because I'm like, whoa, oh, isn't that, I'm like, what a beautiful sight. And kind of forget that I forget that I live in London. I don't know how that's relevant at all, but I wish that I was like more somebody who was like flaneursing about the streets, just walking from one end of London to the other a few times a week, just to get that experience, just to get a more rounded experience of living in a city, rather than working at home and going to my local shop to pick up my packages.
Yeah. But I think it's like, I mean, you get that with Vivian and Leonard's characters. He's the person who, pounds the city streets and covers all the areas and is really
Mm.
quite hardcore about that. And she walks, but she doesn't really, she doesn't scour the city on her
Yeah.
walks in that same way. She's a different sort of walker. Um, and I really liked the way you have a sense of her having had that relationship with the city from being really small, because I think
Mm.
so many of us can identify with that. I mean, she used to, when she was, a young adolescent, walk down into the city and then walk back because she lived so close. But, that thing of waiting to be old enough to be allowed the
Yeah.
city, to own the city. I just thought she captured that really, I really identified with that. Meg has posted, I got to read that though. You better read it than me. Can everybody just look at what Meg's posted? And I'm sorry if you're watching it on catch up. Oh, I should read it, shouldn't I? Because if you're watching it on catch up, you won't get it.
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to read it because I'm too bad a reader. Um, But that stuff about it is basically a really lovely poem piece from Small Kindnesses by Danusha Lemaris. So you can look it up yourself. But just about the brief moments of exchange, which we were talking about earlier, and how the city really, how they're integral really to life in a
Yeah.
city.
Yeah, and I feel like there was some research about how you need these like weak connections in your life to have like a good life, like the connections that you have with the people who work close by and with the bus drivers on the routes that you take and the shops that you frequent, all of this kind of stuff, all of that stuff helps you socially and culturally to feel at home.
There's been so much research lately, hasn't there, because of lockdown and because
Mm.
of, the lockdown generation of teenagers. It's like Mel has just said, I have a lady I pass on the way to work every Friday morning and I miss her when she's not there.
Yeah, that's
That is
really
the
sweet. You
same.
know, so somebody who goes, "Oh, that's unusual. I wonder if are they on holiday? Are they okay?" Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. Or the usual person in the coffee shop. Are they on holiday?
mm,
Maybe they're working a different shift? It's just, and there's been a loads of research done on it lately because of lockdown and
mm,
that, the kind of the teenagey generation, that those who've lost those encounters and didn't form the habit of making
mm,
those encounters.
mm,
Like Nicola's saying, I feel we have so many fewer of those because of phones and lockdown. And people so rarely acknowledge strangers. But I wonder, a thing that I've really noticed since I moved to Edinburgh compared to working for decades in London
mm.
is I don't really feel like that anymore. I don't feel that. Maybe you are an old grump, Nicola. I'm an old grump too. I don't, maybe, I don't think that Scottish people are more friendly or anything. I just think maybe it's a slightly different community because people do live right in the heart of Edinburgh. So maybe it's if it's where you live versus somewhere you go, if
Mm.
you know what I mean to it. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm making it up, making it up. Um, Going back to Vivian Gornick's feminism.
Mm.
It's so interesting the period of time that she covered because thinking about when she was, so when she must have been born, what,
When was she born?
45, 40, 40, no, 35, she's 90, is she?
Yeah.
Yeah, so 35. Um, so she was at college in the probably 50s and early 60s. And so she was at college at a point when, as she said, she wanted to live in the city and have the flat and everything, but she didn't know whether she'd be the artist and intellectual herself or whether she'd be married to him,
Yeah. And she
which
gets
is so,
married twice. So
yeah, before she just realizes that
yeah, marriage is not
that's
for
not going to
her.
cut it for her. And I had the exact same conversation with Helen Garner, who's now well into her 80s, about it
Mm.
taking, I think she got married 3 times before she realized that she really was flogging a dead horse. And I just think that that's so interesting the way that, and it's one of the reasons I love Helen Garner. It's one of the reasons that I absolutely love talking to women who categorically are old women
Yeah.
because they've lived through so many generations of expectation of women and quite often reach that point in their own way of aloneness.
Yeah.
Whether through choice or circumstance, but ultimately it feels like ultimately it becomes a choice. Not
Yeah.
always, because you get people like Isabel Allende who, describes herself as, I can't remember, compulsively heterosexual. And she's on like her third husband, and I interviewed her when she was 79, so she must be 81 or 2 now. And when she finally agreed to marry him because she wasn't sure about doing the marriage thing again, she
Yeah.
did say to him, well, you've only got 20 years because all of her husbands had lasted 20 years. And she's like, she'll be 100, but I can imagine her doing it again. So she's like completely different. But Anyway, I don't know why I went off on that tangent, but I was really interested in what Vivian Gornick said about the feminism being the defining thing about her identity,
Yeah,
and that inner conflict of having been a feminist in the 70s and the struggle to live the life she believed, or that generation of feminists believed they should be allowed to live. So, like,
yeah,
free from traditional roles. Like, I think, as she put it, no equality in love. Well, we'll do without.
yeah.
But then constantly struggling with that. And it
Yeah,
really,
like she realizes that that's like completely phony, like she can't hold that line. Because she's human and she wants desire and to be desired.
it just reminded me of when I'm kind of 10-ish years older than you. And when I was at university, it was probably the next wave of feminism. And there was a real radical feminism is the theory, lesbianism is the practice thing going
Oh
on.
yeah.
And I had a good male friend from home who he went to Manchester Poly, and his girlfriend there dumped him because she was a feminist, and she decided she had to be a lesbian too because she was not being true to her
Yeah.
theory. Anyway, but I did feel like Vivian Gornick's generation fell into the gap between, I think, as she puts it, theory and practice. Whereas
Yeah.
maybe my generation, our generation, certainly the generation of some people here, we fell into the gap between having it all and doing it all.
Yeah.
But at the same, all the time, that's about being brought up to believe, and maybe also wanting to, that you should be pursuing this traditional love thing, but also feeling that somehow it wasn't right.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. Um, it's interesting how she explores all of that in the book because she does it through her relationship with men, but she also does it through her relationship with women. You know, she questions like what is going on in these relationships. Um, she questions like the idea of romantic love and how romantic love can have the qualities in friendship too. And then she talks about like a sexual relationship where she comes to the realization there was no friendship in that
Mm.
sexual relationship, and she says, you know, and without friendship we were both in the wilderness, both alone in the wilderness. And like I'm certainly I'm not an expert on radical feminism and the kind of ideas that she would have been bringing to the writing, but it did interest me that um, what she said is she wanted in this book to account for herself as a feminist, but she does it for me in this way that it doesn't feel like polemical in any way, or like even explicitly. She's not trying to kind of sell a particular political manifesto. She's showing through her relationships and her accounting for these relationships with men and her friends, and by looking at literature she's kind of pulling everything apart and saying, what was that all about? Why do I still desire, want to be desired when the desire makes me feel shameful? Why did that friendship with somebody who I had lots of common interests fizzle out like a bad love affair? And I find that really invigorating as a way of exploring feminist ideas. Um, yeah, she's kind of storytelling rather than um, prolizing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. It's one of the things I really liked about it was that sense that it's like, well, I don't know, I've kind of written that she was good at drawing attention to her failures, but I don't think that that's
Mm.
what I mean. I think it's something to do with getting to maybe that part of your life to be this old and have so little information.
Oh my God, it's
And
such a
there's
good line, isn't it?
such a good line, and it really kind of flies in the face of the whole wisdom thing because I think there's so many different things going on there, but that throughout our lives, that even though we've known better
Yeah.
more than half of the time, we've still wanted, like you say, like maybe the perfect man, to have less wrinkles, to have a flat stomach or whatever, and that kind of constant conflict that runs, I think, even as you get older and arguably a little bit wiser, like Tanya
Mm.
said, acceptance, you
I
know.
Yeah, and Gornick writes about when she's doing her writing about personal narrative, she talks about the essay as a form where you arrive at what you know, and writing as a practice that helps you to arrive at what you know and kind of tease out the insight. And what she does, I guess, is she lays it all bare, like that thing about like maybe she's a bit, did you say hard on herself or um
I know, good at drawing attention to her
good
failures.
failures? Yeah, yeah. So the way in which she confronts her failures isn't to say, look at me, I'm such a bad person, um like I'm whipping myself. It's more an attempt to understand what's driving what drove that feeling of failure, or like how do we find ourselves in situations. Yeah, that's great. Meg's put in the chat there this great Didion quote about I write to find out what I think. And I think Gornick's work helps me work out what I think, if that makes
Mm.
sense, because she's taking us with her on this like journey. Sorry to use the journey word, it's cheesy, but
Yeah.
it's apt. Um, of figuring this stuff out, and also allowing stuff to remain, in contradiction with itself.
Yeah, it's interesting because like the a person I was interviewing this afternoon is a journalist who's written fiction. And she was saying how she'd never understood that. She had never understood that I write to find out what I think, because as a journalist, you find out the facts and then you write them.
But who has the facts about themselves? I mean, like the
Yeah,
idea that we have objective facts about our emotional life or even our histories, I think, is just not realistic. So maybe that's why she's probably a great journalist.
yeah, not a memoirist.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Nicola is asking, and I don't know the answer to this. You might. Do we know if Gornick has written in recent years about the erosion of women's rights in the US?
I'm not, I don't know. That's the honest answer. I would imagine that she's written kind of adjacent to that. I know that she gets I know that she's either written or spoken about like her frustration with the same questions being asked, that I guess her generation thought that they were going to overcome, 40 odd years
I
ago,
think I read that.
the
Yeah.
70s. I think she didn't, this isn't the same, it's not kind of linked to anything like Roe versus Wade or anything like that. It's a bit more flippant, but she was asked a question about, do you think a woman needs a room of her own in order to write or something? And she was just like, oh my, I can't believe I'm getting asked this question. So I
Yeah, it
think there's a
must be
certain
frustrating.
frustration about fighting the same battles, I guess, that she was fighting in the 60s and 70s. And I'm
Well,
sure
and
she'd have a really
now,
interesting perspective on what's happening now. I don't know, but I don't know if she's written about it.
no, I haven't seen, and I think, I mean, they literally are fighting the same battles they were fighting it, in 1969, if not,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, grim, grim. Um, no, I can't remember what I was going to say now. I feel completely lost my thread. I've gone off into a bit of a spiral. I would love to know her perspective too. I've totally gone off into a Trump spiral. Um,
It's not funny, but it's like,
it's
oh my
not.
God, like the
Oh, it's
theatre of the
no. It's
absurd. It's like,
really, really, really
yeah.
grim. In fact, it might have been in the same interview.
Mm.
She said, in fact, it was the headline. She said, "Memoirists aren't writers."
Mm.
What did she mean, do you think? And do you agree?
I don't know what she means, if I'm completely honest. Memoirists aren't writers. I might not have read that article. I think like that one might have stuck with me.
I
So
didn't know what she meant.
no, I don't know. It's
And I
probably a
can't Google
quote
it because
taken
I'll
out
mess
of
up.
some it's probably a quote taken out of some really beautiful elegant thought that she had that on its
Oh,
own
bloody journalist.
completely
Yeah,
warps it. Yeah.
you're right. You're right. It probably is. Although I don't remember noticing that when I read it. Anyway, in fact, Nicholas asked a good question for you, and this ties into what we were talking about before we let everybody in,
Yeah.
and it might give you the necessary rocket that you require. Nicholas says, "Have you got any books in the pipeline at the moment?"
So I'm working on a new nonfiction book. I'm working on the proposal for it, but I can't tell you what it is yet. Because if I tell you what it is yet, I'm feeling like superstitious about it. But yeah, so I do have something in the pipeline that I'm hoping will be really interesting. And it's linked to ideas around intimacy, so I give you that. So that's that. I'm also trying to write a novel, which feels like a big cliche because there's a very well-worn path of like the poet to novelist pipeline. I'm not sure if I can walk down that pipe, but we'll see. So I'm really hoping to publish more books soon-ish.
Who are the, I mean, no, I'm going to go back. What made you make the first move, if you like, from poetry to memoir?
I think it was a lot about I'd been writing about particular themes kept coming up in my poems, and a lot of that was about kind of ambivalence around motherhood, um, a kind of shame and loneliness in relation to not having romantic love in my life. And I found that I reached a point where I just wanted to speak more directly. And poetry isn't the form for that. At least the sort of poems that I write aren't the form for that. And I wanted to write as though I was speaking to somebody directly. So that was the motivation really. I and for a long time I resisted it because I felt like because I didn't have an English degree and I hadn't done a creative writing masters or anything like that, that I wouldn't, I don't know, like I didn't give myself permission to do it. I had a bit of a chip on my shoulder that I couldn't do it. I wasn't permitted somehow. Um, but because I was kind of involved in the poetry community quite a lot, I was invited to write some bits and pieces of prose for poetry magazines, and that gave me a lot of confidence to start writing, yeah, personal essays. So that's how it came about. And I'm really glad because um to a certain extent, like I feel like I've found my form. And it would have been so easy just to resist the pull and to deny it and say, oh, you're not good enough, or you're not clever enough, or whatever you're too old, or whatever
Mm.
objection that my brain could pull out for me. Um, uh, and it's kind of open, it's like really blown up my whole thinking about writing in different forms, And it's kind of blown up my reading as well. So that's been really pleasurable because I was just reading poetry before, occasionally a novel if I was feeling really generous.
Really? So you are like hardcore and you're reading.
Hardcore, just reading poems. And I would really like recommend reading a lot of poetry if you can. But yeah. So
Yeah. So I mean, I was going to ask you which memoirists influenced you, and Tanya has asked who your favorite
oh
memoirists
right, yeah.
are. So apart
Um
from Vivian, who,
So apart from Vivian, so one memoir that I'm really obsessed with is Mary Gaitskill's Lost Cat, which is a
oh,
short
yes,
memoir about her adopting a cat. And it's kind of it's about loss, really. That's one. The other that is really important to me is Tove Ditlevson's youth.
it's a
What's it called?
trilogy, isn't it?
It's the trilogy. I'm like youth, something, and dependency. I've forgotten what the middle one is. But if you Google Copenhagen trilogy, it will come up, and that is extraordinary. And also, I feel like sits within this kind of universe of Gornick and the way Ferrante writes about women's experiences and kind of interiority.
And wasn't she a poet as well?
Yes, she was, and they've just Penguin actually have just issued uh her collected poems translated into English for the first time. That's just come out. It's called There Lives Inside of Me a Young Girl Who Will Not Die. Sorry, I remember the name of the book now. It's Childhood, Youth and Dependency. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Nicola's just,
That's so
thank you,
timeless.
Nicola.
Oh dear, I was saying to Sam just before this that I was like going back through The Odd Woman in the City today because my brain, my perimenopausal brain, finds it really difficult to have anything stick into it. But like obviously you can't get a whole book to stick in you unless you've written it, and even then, you might have to go back and like refresh your memory. But it's now even little things like the title of a book, which is one of my favorite books that I feel are the most important books I've ever read. Um, oh dear.
Yeah, yeah. I think we've all been there. That's the thing. And it happens like the minute as well you try to grasp it, it just
Just goes whoosh.
goes.
Um, yeah, so those two books I really highly recommend if you're, especially if you're interested in writing memoir yourself.
They're
Um,
kind of very different ends of the spectrum, aren't they? Because I mean, obviously the Copenhagen trilogy is a trilogy, so it looks like a fat book, but it's actually three thin
mm.
books. But Lost Cat is teeny.
It's really small and it's just like, it's just like this slice of her life, but it's just so it's so potent. Um yeah, I just think it's incredible.
We're nearly out of time, and it's flown by. And we were both, before we started, we were like, got no idea how this is going to go. Never done this before, but it's absolutely flown. Has anybody got anything else they want to ask or say? Or, I really like the picture on top of your head, Amy.
Thanks.
The Stevie Smith.
Oh, it's amazing, isn't it? It's like one of her book covers.
I
Oh,
love
well,
it.
it's really cool. I got it. Do you remember there was a bookshop called The Second Shelf, which had a physical bookstore but is now an online bookstore, but it's rare books by women. And I got it from the shop when there was a shop there when I went to do an event. I just fell in love with it. Because it's got Stevie
It's
Smith's illustration.
gorgeous,
Oh, thank you everyone
gorgeous.
for being so nice and kind.
Oh, so you want me to do it again? Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for being our guinea pig, Amy. And thank
My
you, everybody, for
pleasure.
coming. And don't forget, we've got the complete other end of the spectrum on Monday, where, because this is the first month I've ever done two, a fiction and a non-fiction. So Monday, we're talking about night watching with Tracy Sierra. And it's bloody terrifying. If you haven't read it,
Oh, really?
yeah, it's
I don't read
absolutely
scary
terrifying.
books. I'm too much of a baby.
Oh. Oh, and Laurie's going to read Arrangements in Blue.
Oh, thank you.
Well, just move it to the top of the TBR stack. Get it up there now. So thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Amy. I
Thanks,
really
Sam.
appreciate it. And I'll see you guys on Monday, and I'll see you soon, hopefully. And yes, more of these chats. Promise.
Everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye. Bye.